So welcome today, you guys. I'm Christine McGrath, WellFit Living, and I do optimization through nutrition and movement. We've been talking a lot about peak performance and flow, and I work a lot with recreational amateur athletes, which is really cool. And Charles today, he will introduce himself, but we're going to be talking about the optimism bias, which we were talking at the end of the conversation that we just had, that this is a very interesting time to have this conversation.
It is, I think. Yeah, I think it's a very good time. Excuse me for 1 second, because I'm just going to switch off the fan, because now it's annoying me. Hang on.
Apparently it's like 35 in London, which is very hot.
Yeah. It is awesome heat, I think, for London anyway. Right, so as you all know, I hope by now you know, I'm Charles Leon. I still am a designer. Actually, just as a brief sort of background, I started out life as a theatre designer, not as a hotel designer, which I ended up becoming. Worked in films as well, and then gradually progressed to designing hotels, which I loved. And then throughout the years, I've done quite a lot of public speaking, mostly about the combination of neuroscience and how designers think. And you might think there's absolutely no connection at all, but I assure you there is. What we're going to talk about today, Christina and I, is something called the optimism bias. Now, I'm going to start just by, I'm going to tell you a little silly story about my son when he was little, playing football in the garden with his friends. I was upstairs when I used to have a study upstairs, and I could hear them playing football, and they were having obviously a great time. And all of a sudden it all exploded into a massive argument. I mean, these are all boys sort of out there playing football until I thought they were going to literally lynch each other. So I came down to break it up and said, what's the problem? And they were arguing. My son said his shot was a goal. The goalkeeper said it wasn't a goal. So I said, well, you know, where's the goal? And it was just two pullovers on the ground that they put down there. But what transpired, of course, is that they didn't have a football. They'd lost the football 5 minutes before across the other neighbour's fence and were playing without a football. They were verbalizing and visualizing everything. Now, how do you have an argument about whether it's a goal or not when there's no ball? They're playing a game with no football, with no real goalpost, and yet they were arguing whether it was a goal or not. So this is the triumph of visualization, optimism over reality. And as far as they were concerned, this was as real an argument as any argument could be. So just for 2 seconds, what I'd quite like you to do, because it forms the sort of the basis of everything we're going to do, is just close your eyes for 2 seconds and just imagine any future you like with you in it. Any future you like. And I'm watching you and see if you're closing your eyes or not. Okay, that's it. That's all you need to do. That's the exercise. Now, I would bet that 97% of you, at least, that sounds very precise, but it's not, it's rubbish. 97% of you visualize something good. I don't believe that many of you would have visualized something terrible happening to you. It's just not our way. And this is basically the optimism bias at work. This is what it does. It shows you everything through rose-tinted glasses, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. Now, first of all, I'm going to just round it up a bit with just a few biases. We have natural biases. We can't help ourselves. Also very relevant to these times as well, which I won't go into right now. Confirmation bias, my favorite, because my wife suffers terribly from it. And this is the tendency to search for, interpret, or focus and remember any information in a way that confirms your own preconception. So once my wife has said something, that's it. Everything has to fall into that particular tram line, and she will find everything that confirms that belief. There may be tons of evidence that doesn't, but she will find only the facts that confirm her belief. That goes on to say another bias, which is what's called the blind spot bias. which is the tendency to see yourself as less biased than other people. Well, no, that's not the case. We've all got them, and we all do. In fact, that's partially how our brain works. Another one would be an authority bias. So this is the tendency to give, to believe that there is greater accuracy when somebody in authority tells it to you. And the obvious example of that is, say, if a doctor's wearing a white coat, you're probably going to take his opinion on what he tells you. But if he comes in sort of flip-flops, jeans, and a t-shirt, then you might think, you know, I'm not sure about this guy's opinion. So it does matter. We do listen to authority. And then, of course, there's the one that we suffer from the most, I think, is superiority bias, which is overestimating one's desirable qualities. We all overestimate how wonderful we are, how nice we are, how good we are to people relative to other people. For instance, if I were to ask any of you, are you good drivers? Again, 97% of you would say, yeah, I'm a really good driver. Nobody says they're a bad driver. Nobody does, because we overestimate. And that brings us basically to what we're talking about today, which is the optimism bias. Now, there are hundreds of different biases and cognitive sort of illusions and disillusions. But the optimism bias is, I'm going to actually read this definition because it's very, very good, I think. It's the tendency to be over-optimistic and underestimating greatly the probability of undesirable outcomes and overestimating favourable and pleasing outcomes. So that's what we're here to discuss, is because I personally think that without an optimism bias, we would not be where we are as a human race right now. And it's absolutely critical for our genes and for our evolution that we are planning and thinking ahead. So if you think about, well, you are thinking about optimism, then basically what optimism does, again, with visualization, with many of the other things we've spoken about, is this ability to travel in time, to see the future. Now, optimism appears to be completely about the future, but as I'll come to in a moment, it's also about the past and how we view the past. One of the great cognitive skills that we have over and above most, or if not all animals, is this ability to plan our future and to look forward to something, to say, you know what, this spade that I dig the garden with, if I just made the handle a little bit sort of rounder and softer, then it would be a bit better. This is the optimism bias. That is also why innovators or anyone who does anything has to think forward, and thinking forward has to think of the possibility that something can happen. So in that respect, it becomes a survival tactic. So it's absolutely necessary for our survival that we are optimistic. And that may be, sometimes it might be that it's sort of fatally optimistic as well. False beliefs are very, very important. A simple example, right? Let's imagine that we're out in the African prairie, is that the right word? Savannah. We're out in the savannah and we hear rustling in the grass. Now, it's much better if we believe that this might be a snake, because then we'll take action to avoid it. If we didn't have that kind of bias, then we might think, oh, it's just the rustling in the grass of the wind and we're all fine, and you'd end up dead. So that's one example of how it might be a survival tactic. But what it does do is it allows us to consciously travel in our minds, and that's very important for evolution. That's basically how we move cultures on. And if we didn't do that, well, what's the alternative? You wouldn't be looking forward, and therefore you would be stuck in the present moment, which means that nothing would change. So we'd still be, well, I don't even know if we'd be roaming around sort of hunting bison or whatever it might be, but nothing would have progressed. We would be stuck in the present moment, like most animals are now. And I think this is one of the big differences between humans and animals, is that our ability to think forwards and to think backwards and to think past and past future as well. So if you imagine a future, this is what Christina and I were talking about, is that you have to you have to do that with a positive bias. It has to be something connected to positivity. Now, what's actually going on in the mind, in the brain, is this is all due to the big sort of frontal lobe development and the cortex development that allows us, particularly this area at the front, which allows us to plan the executive actions, all that strategy is all up here in our cortex. And the reason that it's so sort of crammed and folded is because the skull is not quite big enough to fit it all in, so it's all twisted and folded within itself as it has developed. So progress, the great ability we have of looking forwards and looking back and looking at the present moment, if there is such a thing as the present moment, but that's a philosophical argument that we won't go into right now, is our ability to monitor progress against expectations. And we'll come to how expectations sort of play out in all of this in a moment. But there's a couple of neurotransmitters and hormones and chemicals that play a very key part in all of this. One of them is, of course, oxytocin. And oxytocin is known to reduce uncertainty, and it's also very much connected with depression, as is cortisol, I think, and also serotonin as well. The serotonin and oxytocin are the two main things that are connected with our optimism, and then eventually with dopamine, with our reward system as well. And these things are running in cycles. What they're basically doing is they're enablers. They enable certain connections to happen. They're not the connection themselves. So that's different, and there is a reason to explain that we'll come to later when we talk about Prozac. But that's a bit late.
The one thing that we did mention before is that by this optimistic bias, we can also make those patterns happen.
Yeah, I'm going to come to, So that would all be about self-fulfilling prophecies, okay. But we will come to that.
Okay.
I think that, unless I've lost it.
No, oxytocin and dopamine. Love it.
Yeah. So basically, this is, and I'll come to the study that proves this, but this is all about, we tend to be more optimistic. We tend to be happier when we have control of our lives. And the great study that was done is called the Whitehall study, done in 1967 with the English Civil Service. Now, they carried this study out, I'm pretty sure it was nearly 40 years, and they may still be doing it. They did it first with men and then with women. What they found with this study were two incredibly important conclusions, because everybody thought that stress, must ruin your life and ruin your longevity of life. And they found, no, that's not the case. It wasn't stress, because some chief executives or people in higher management positions were under enormous stress. What they found was that people who had more control over the decisions they were able to make had longer lifespans or a longer life expectancy. And so if you take, say, the tea lady or the cleaners or the doorman, they would have a shorter life expectancy. And this is sort of completely counterintuitive. Shorter life expectancy than, say, someone who is in a high managerial position. And the study was carried out by James. And the other conclusion was that that hope connected with control is the thing that allows us to embrace our goals and stay committed to them. Now, that then comes back to something that Christina and I were talking about this thing about having purpose, giving meaning to a life. It doesn't have to be a very high purpose, but all of these things about sort of goals and moving towards goals give us purpose and therefore give us control. So when you, for instance, if you design something, then you're thinking ahead of what might be, and that rejuvenates your own sort of cognitive faculties as well. So the other conclusion, of course, is that pessimists do die younger. Also, a very long study by James. So if you just want to live a bit longer, just get your optimism up. That's all you have to do. It's very simple. That and omega-3, of course. We're not sure between Christina and I exactly the relationship between oxytocin, serotonin, and cortisol. Now, cortisol is obviously key in stress, and I'm not sure how that relationship works. I don't know if you know, Christina.
Well, I know obviously that increasing our cortisol increases it's related to a stress hormone, but when we're talking about it, it's like if we hold this optimistic bias and we have this vision of control, then obviously the stress hormone would probably be relatively down, or at least not overused.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it comes in.
I think with all of these type of neurotransmitters, hormones, it's all a sort of sliding scale of balances. It's not one thing or another. There's not a lot of this and a lot of that, although there may be, but it's about balancing. And sometimes when one thing increases, it does it at the expense of another. And of course, the simple solution, as we have told you all, and I hope you're doing, is take omega-3. The only thing that does everything, it is the panacea of everything, is omega-3. Take your cod liver oil or whatever, or fish oil.
Fish oil, yeah.
Exactly. So that brings us to the next section. This is a sort of pet love of mine, if you like, is that basically optimism and any planning becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The minute you think something and you think, right, I'm going to do this, well, you start making it happen. So it's not a question of, things happening. I mean, we got into a very complicated discussion about fatalism and fate, and forget it. It's rubbish. It's complete rubbish. There is no fate. There might be reasons why things happen, but what there is definitely is our ability to plan and therefore influence the future. And I find that that completely fascinating, that that because we're able to generate ideas, which are just ideas, they're just thoughts, just electricity, that we are then able to actually sort of make those things happen. So, and if you think about it, you create your own futures. Now, it's a question of how much you embrace that, but in effect, you are the creator of your own. Now, that doesn't mean that terrible things don't happen. I'm not saying that at all. They do, and they happen to good people as well. But basically, the prediction of a future outcome influences the outcome, which is a strange sort of tautology. So the phrase that I come up with for this is that prophecy propagates the probable. So, which is a nice bit of alliteration, that's all. But it is the case, is that that the more you predict, the more you try to make that, or plan, I should say, more you try to make that happen, the more it does happen, or even if it doesn't happen, you reassess and reframe your progress.
And this goes along with that's you're on the path to your vision. And if you get off the path, you can still get back onto the path, and you're determining the path. And so you're making decisions based on your future vision. And there's that Alice in Wonderland quote that we use sometimes. I know that's like, well, where do you want to go? It's like, well, I don't know. Then any path is fine. But, it's like...
Very existentialist.
Yeah.
All roads lead somewhere.
All roads lead to nowhere. Anyway.
I don't know.
I like that.
And it depends on which course you said, I guess. But then we come to sort of... I suppose one of the big things that we all connect with optimism is happiness. Does optimism make you happier? Well, simple answer is not necessarily, but maybe. Only maybe, because I think it's also, and I think we agree on this, Christina, is that happiness is the outcome of other things that happen. It's not the thing in itself. Now, I'm not sure that I entirely agree with myself on this. So, because it's very complicated. And because they're emotions, I don't know if an emotion is an outcome or if it's actually the thing that makes it happen. It's complex. And unfortunately, so many things connected with how we think and why we think and if we think at all are so intertwined and complex and difficult to explain. And a lot of them are very circular or spiral or balancing, and whatever images we use, it's very complex. But I do think that happiness is a result and is not something you can actually do. You can't do happiness. You can do joy, you can do smiling. And as we said, there is that wonderful report that says if you force yourself to smile, in fact, if you just put a pen in your mouth for a day, you will end up feeling happier, apparently. Well, students anyway feel happier, but then it doesn't take much to make them happy. So, but what they have found, what researchers found, the things that give us most happiness are social and familial connections, control on our lives, and purpose. So these three factors sort of pretty much sum up everyone, I think, in terms of the pursuit of happiness. It isn't money, obviously. I mean, you know, we've all heard that, but it ain't money. Money might enable things to happen that couldn't otherwise happen, but it's not money itself. Now, right, a little bit of technicalities is that the positive emotions that you end up having as a result of your optimism and hopefully your success in achieving some part of that sort of direction is it's produced by the amygdala and something called the restral anterior cingulate cortex. Now, these two things play together and play off each other, and I won't go into any more technical detail, but those are the basic areas of your brain that are producing this optimism and this constant sort of pursuit of optimism, not the reward mechanism, because that's to do with dopamine. That is, you know, dopamine kicks in afterwards and says, "Oh, that was nice, do it again, do it again, do it again." And we all know what that's all about. So optimism is basically a belief in your ability to control your future. Now, of course, the opposite side of that is depression. Depression is the inability, or could be defined, I should say, as the inability to see a positive future. And I think that sort of rings very true for me, but it is obviously, it can be hormonal, chemical, all sorts of other things as well combined that are causing that to happen. So I think it's expectations that make us happy, not necessarily the event in itself. And I suppose the example of this that we were talking about is flirting. Flirting is much better than the real thing, honestly. It really is. We all know that. But it is, because the expectation of the event is, well, I don't know, it's sometimes better than the event itself. Who knows? But it's this future belief, and expectation is an incredibly important part of optimism and how your brain works with optimism. So optimism is crucial for happiness, but it's a necessity. It's a necessity, but it's not necessarily the happiness itself. You can't just be optimistic and be happy. It causes happiness. I want to have a quick look at sort of optimism and looking to the past, because what most of us do is we look on most past events, but this is not true for sort of others, for mental disorders or things like that. But most of us look at the past and we tend to just slightly make the picture a bit more rosy, a bit sort of warmer, a bit fuzzier, a bit nicer. Now, we do that in order to be able to use that in the future. So it is literally back to the future. So we use the past in order to color the future. And we compress a lot of our emotions into sort of exciting events. They become very small events or very big events that are triggered by very small things, but we tend to sort of color them. Now, this was, there was an amazing study done on the people who survived 9/11 in terms of the quality of their memories, and how everybody saw the event differently, but that's not the crucial part, and that their memories changed over time. That we tend to reframe our memories in order to suit the knowledge that we have, the future that we want, and the past that we think we've had. Now, that doesn't, again, it's a sliding scale. It's very difficult because that doesn't necessarily work for trauma, doesn't work for phobias. For instance, we were talking about spiders earlier, that, you know, you you're afraid of a spider because you think it may do you harm or whatever, for whatever reason, and so you back away from it. But an optimist would probably either let the spider just run away rather than kill it. So I think that the problem is, the difficulty with optimism and the past is that the past is not the reality of the thing that happened. And we all see that with history. History gets rewritten by the victors, of course, but I don't want to get too political. That's for another day. So I think we only remember the arousing bits and forget the boring bits, is what I'm trying to say.
And that's also, that contributes to us coming back to our optimism bias and how we define ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And we overestimate the positive, always, and we gain imprecise picture from the past. The great example here in the UK is the project of Crossrail, which is this huge sort of underground railway that's going from one side of London to the other side of London and beyond. And I think it was estimated, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say £1 billion first. It's now up to, I think, £6 billion. It has gradually, incrementally increased because they were over optimistic, first of all, in the time it would take to do and the cost of doing it. And we all do that. Sydney Opera House is the very famous example that started out whatever the cost was and escalated to nearly 3 times the cost. So we don't often prepare in our optimism accurate forecasts of the future, but that's not the point. That's not why we do it. We do it so as we can take the next step forward, and they're small steps. The example of this, I suppose, is Friday is always better than Sunday. Why is Friday better than Sunday? Because we're expecting a whole weekend, whereas Sunday, we know that the weekend's over, and Monday, for most of us anyway, is work again. From my point of view, and from the point of view of interest anyway, is that all creators, be they innovators, be they even creative accountants, believe it or not, whoever it may be, you must have optimism, because in order to believe that you can do something, you have to believe in the possibility that it can be done. And you have to believe in the possibility of a different future. I mean, that's the whole thing about optimism, is that you're imagining or believing in a better future than you might see in reality. Well, I'm going to tell you about a horrible, very difficult study that was done by a guy called Seligman, and it was done in the 1960s. But what it engenders was something called the learned helplessness theory. Now, what he did, which I don't think he would quite get away with now, but he put dogs into a small chamber, had a harness on them, and gave them an electric shock. And the dogs at first jumped, but they couldn't escape. They couldn't get away from the electric shock. And so they did this repeatedly until the dogs actually became reasonably passive to the electric shocks and accepted it. Then they took the harness off. And what is astonishing is that the dogs then had learned to accept the electric shock and lay down and just took the shock, rather than trying to jump out and escape. Now, what that highlighted, and that unfortunately they didn't do it on humans, although there have been tests quite similar to this, but about different things where they didn't administer shocks, but they said they were administering shocks. And that's more about authority, we'll talk about on another day. It was the same sort of thing exists. It's this lack of control. Where you don't have a lack of control, you slip into depression. And that's the key, and that's what this learned helplessness theory suggested, is that if you completely and utterly lose control, you accept your situation and you sink into depression. And they found also that the same is true for people who sink into depression. They either increase their weight or lose their weight. It has a physical effect as well. But the point is that you can learn to be optimistic, I think. I think practice makes you optimistic. I'm not quite sure. You might be sort of curious to know how Prozac works with all of this. And I know Prozac is a bit of an epidemic in the US, apart from the epidemic that's there at the moment. But there is a real problem with Prozac, I think, and with other drugs as well. I'm sure that someone here probably knows better than I do which ones. But the thing is that Prozac is actually what's called SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So what it does is it sort of interrupts certain signals and certain synaptic connections. And what it does is it doesn't change the mood. What it does is it actually changes the cognitive bias. It changes how you view things. So that's how they work. They're not changing your mood as such. They're changing the step before the mood, which is how your synapses connect and what sort of connections they do. Which then brings me to expectations. So, expectations. A key factor within optimism is the anticipation and the expectation of the event to come. And sometimes this is almost as good as the experience. Now, they've proven this through a lot of fMRI studies, that the same areas of the brain light up when you have a good experience as when you expect or see a picture of a good experience. The advert that absolutely nailed it, I don't know if you had it in the US, but in the UK, was the Guinness advert, which was all good things come to those who wait. So the anticipation, the expectation is nearly as good as the event itself. So if you imagine the opposite end of this, which is that dentists, right? Until about 10 years ago, I didn't go to the dentist for about 20 years because I was so afraid of the dentist. And the fear of the dentist made the fear of the dentist worse. So it got worse and worse and worse because the anticipation of the dentist is worse than the dentist itself, as I found out eventually. In fact, it was actually a very pleasant experience in the end. So I think there is the whole connection between anticipation and optimism. And I have a sort of secret theory. Again, we were talking about it earlier, weren't we, Christina, about placebos. Is that this may be a little bit, I mean, placebos have now been sort of scientifically proven to work. You know, you can give someone a sugar pill or I mean, I don't even know if it's sugar. You can give someone a placebo and it works. You know, even if you tell them that you're giving them a placebo, it still works, which is testament to the brain's ability to sort of to do things that you didn't even believe might be possible. But it's interesting with placebos because I think that's similar to the system that kicks into place with expectation and anticipation, is that then certain sort of chemicals, hormones start sort of running around and say, giving different signals to all these synapses, say, right, you're allowed to do this, you're allowed to do this, and so it works. So I suppose if you anticipate a really painful event, it will have a negative, or painful emotionally as well as physically, a negative effect on any well-being. I mean, and I think that's pretty much proven. I mean, if you take the extreme examples of people being tortured, it does have a physical effect. I mean, unless you've got an incredibly strong sort of mindset or metabolism, there's no question but that the anticipation is just as bad. And part of torture, certainly, is all about the anticipation as well as the act itself, is the fear of the act.
And I was just going to interject here. I think this might go on as well, but I think it's interesting in wellness, if you are hopeful that your outcome is going to be positive, and you can visualize yourself in that space of whether it's a victory or a speed or a health goal, if you can visualize and you have hope with that, and then you have the tools, it's much easier than if you're so far off that you can't even imagine.
Yeah, I think also that if you that this really is a case where you can fake it till you make it. I do think if you put yourself in a positive frame of mind, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy, you will end up by having a positive outlook on everything you see. Again, it's the red car syndrome, isn't it? Yeah. Until somebody says to you, how many red cars can you see? You think, well, I didn't notice any red cars. Yeah. But suddenly you start seeing red cars everywhere. So I think that's what that's all about. And then, this ability to use your imagination and visualization in order to thrust yourself basically into the future. And I think also the more vividly that you can imagine and visualize, then the greater the pleasure of the event as well. So if you can absolutely nail what eating really great chocolate feels like, then the truth is you don't really need to eat it. You can just imagine it, which would be great. It doesn't work very well for sex, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But I do think that there's a very strong connection with practice, with learning to do it, with taking a positive mindset, and actually sort of beginning to control how your mind views the world in order to see how your mind views the world. Because these things go round and round and round, and they're sort of learning cycles rather than single direction. Which is why I think a lot of business management gurus actually don't quite get it right when they say, set your goal and hit your goal and do all these steps and everything. Yes, you do, but some of it is very cyclical. You will go forwards and then return back and forwards and back and rolling forward. In fact, actually, a wheel is probably a very good metaphor.
I do agree.
For it.
It's almost, and that's just kind of the same thing with for your goals, and even for races, there's going to be a taper period. There's going to be the race, big event, and then there's going to be a rest period. But you can't be on your race the whole time.
No, and that's really true for anyone sort of preparing for a big event, is that you need to sort of gently sort of ride yourself up to peak performance. That's why I feel so sorry for the Olympic athletes this year, because they must have all been working for years to get themselves right to the point at which they're at their absolute optimum best. And then suddenly to get that taken away from you, you have to think, oh my word, I've got to do this all over again, and gradually build up to that absolute critical point. As a designer or as any sort of creative, I don't think you have that problem. You can do it every day, every minute. It doesn't matter at all. In fact, I was just reading the book by Danny Gregory, or just at lunchtime. I was just flicking through it with all the drawings and everything. And he was talking about the same sort of thing, is that, you have to learn to see differently, not just to look. And that is a question of practice. And he talks about that he draws every day, and he draws ordinary things. But he says you must do it every day. This is the journaling thing that we were talking about last week, it is about the repetition and then the criticism that has to go within the repetition as well that makes it happen. The other thing about sort of anticipation is that the probability of an event also affects the anticipation as well. So if you believe it's possible, your anticipation will get better. So when they eventually open all the pubs here, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very, very, very excited about that.
When they open up the world again, we're all going to be very excited about travel.
And also, the truth is that the closer to the event you get, the more excitement you have. I mean, and that's why you get nervous. And the reverse, the absolute reverse is absolutely true as well, is that if you're about to do something that you're absolutely dreading, it gets worse as you get closer to that moment until you suddenly do it and you find it's not such a problem. So I think the other thing is that we always sort of, particularly our optimism biases, tend to overestimate the probability of positive events. I mean, the simple example of this is, of course, marriage, is that nobody, or practically nobody, goes into any marriage without thinking that it's going to last forever and it's true love and that's it. Well, the statistics don't hold that up at all, not even close. I think it's 1 in 4 marriages collapse within 10 years, and then something like half of marriage. I don't know the exact statistics, but I do know.
That comes back to that we all think we're all above average.
Yes.
All be
absolutely
above average. However,
I think, well, and the truth is, ask, particularly, dare I say it, ask men if they're good drivers, and I've yet to hear anybody say, no, I'm a terrible driver. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And I think the other thing is that more optimistic people tend to imagine positive events more vividly. And this is why it's a very good idea just to play and to practice with visualization, to visualize things, because the more you do it, the better you get at it. And the more rewarding it becomes for you to actually do these sort of events. There are sort of two big styles, if you like, of approach to the world. And let's say there's an optimistic style and there's a pessimistic style. But without any doubt, the optimistic style increases your anticipation and your enjoyment and your pleasure. The pessimistic style does pretty much the exact opposite of that. Is that if, and also the problem with the pessimistic style is that it's regressive.
Yeah.
It sort of regresses more quickly than an optimistic style. An optimistic style may grow gently, but a pessimistic style will start to exponentially increase downwards, if down is the right metaphor. So now there was another interesting study about delayed gratification, and also picked up by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, called Temporal Discounting or Delayed Gratification. And the study was that apparently people with a more optimistic style are more likely to delay gratification than people with a pessimistic style. And part of the reasoning for that is, they reasoned, is that when you're optimistic, you realize, or when you're frequently optimistic, you realize the pleasure of anticipation and the pleasure of sort of growth towards that point. Whereas when you're pessimistic, then you're receding from that point. So we tend to value things more that we have in the present moment as well, which is the dichotomy of it, than we do things in the future. So we're constantly bringing the future forward towards us with this temporal discounting, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense.
And then this is where I brought in, when we just were previously talking, Charles, about the marshmallow test. And that the delayed gratification group of kids who waited to receive 2 marshmallows actually were more successful in life, and probably
that's an amazing, I mean, it's a very famous test, and an amazing correlation is what they found in that test is that children, I think they were 4 or 5 years old, who were able to delay gratification, that is, not eat the marshmallow until the person came back, actually ended up being more successful, whatever that means, or more fulfilled in life in future, because they tracked those children for years beyond that. So that's really a sort of strange outcome to that, that when you're able to visualize, because obviously delayed gratification is very closely related to visualizing a a future, because you're actually delaying that future
but they were delaying for
span
for a better future is what they were really doing, because they were getting double.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one other really interesting study that is, I mean, drove me mad, I have to say, because it is so brilliant. They asked people, students as usual, of course, they asked people, how much would you pay to have an electric shock right now, an electric shock in an hour, an electric shock in a day, or an electric shock in a year, or in 20 years' time? And so they correlated how much people would pay. I don't have the exact statistics, but of course, I'd be very interested to know what anybody thought happened with that. But most people said, do it now, get it over and done with. Now, I think they increased the amount of money they would receive if they waited 20 years or 10 years or whatever it was. But most people said, no, just get it over and done with now. So we're back to the dentist, is that obviously the thing to do is to get it over and done with now, get the bad stuff out of the way, then we can get on with life. So it's the anticipation that people wanted to avoid, and they wanted to avoid the anticipation of pain in the future, because they'd have to think about it all the way up to that point. Even if it was in an hour, you'd be thinking about, is it going to really hurt? Is it going to really sort of frees up my muscle, what's going to happen? So again, that's why Friday is better than Sunday. So what this sort of concludes, in a sense, is that all the decisions we make and our actions, they actually alter our preferences. Now, again, it becomes a cyclical thing. It's not a straight line. So, for instance, and it's similar to continuity bias. So if I go out and go to a shop and I choose some red shoes, I will convince myself afterwards that I like red shoes because I bought red shoes. So the actions that we take do influence how we think in the future of that action having taken place. It's a very sort of strange conundrum, but we buy into our own decisions, and those decisions influence how we buy into the next decisions. So I suppose it's partly related to learning and how we learn, but the fact that the decisions we make influence the decisions we make is a very odd conundrum, and we buy into it, we believe it. You know, we infer sort of preferences by observing our own choices. That's crazy. So if I've accidentally bought something and I get challenged as to why did you buy this, as I do sometimes, is that another book you bought? Yes, but it's really important and I have to have it because I have to read this and I have to prepare for this. I mean, I'm going to find reasons, and that's all sort of, it's not exactly the optimism bias, but it's very connected to the way that we sort of want to confirm our own actions and believe that they are right and correct. I mean, it's very rare to find people who will instantly admit, well, for instance, politicians. When did you last hear a politician say, oh, sorry, I was wrong, I've changed my mind and the evidence has changed? Never, never. All politicians ever do is they stick to what they know, because we value consistency and we value commitment. And that's a part of the whole thing of, you know, you have to be consistent. I don't really think you have to be, but we do value it, definitely. So I just want to very briefly, if we can, have we got time? Yeah. Talk about dopamine and dopamine cycles, because dopamine, it's not exactly right, but if you think of it as the back end of what we do, and serotonin and oxytocin at the front end of what we do, it's not quite like that, but it helps for me to explain it. So dopamine kicks in after the event, when it's had the result of the event. So it's the hungry monster that says, you know, oh, that was good, do it again, do it again. So that's where dopamine sort of is connected to the reward system. And the reward system, of course, then begins to inform everything else, saying, well, you know, send more oxytocin, send more serotonin, do it more, because the dopamine wants the reward. So we've got to have it. So that's the food cycles, that's the chocolate cycles, all sorts of compulsive behaviors are connected to that dopamine cycle. And that sort of positive commitment to things is part of the optimism bias and keeps us sort of wanting to move forward all the time and to reinvent it, to recreate and to innovate, which is that's where I come from on all of this, is that the optimism bias is crucial to innovation and to the progress of all cultures, I think. So reframing, I'm just going to do a quick bit on reframing. There's this wonderful study of a cult in Chicago that predicted the end of the world. You know, optimistically, they said, well, it depends how you look at it, of course, but they said the world is going to end on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Definitely, no question about it, the world is going to end. So fortunately, some social scientists went in to study them, and I think they actually infiltrated the cult to do it. So, of course, it gets to Wednesday and they're all getting very excited. Here comes the anticipation of the world is going to end and the aliens are going to come. They're going to pick us up. They're going to take us in a spaceship and we'll be safe, but you'll be doomed because you didn't believe us. Of course, it gets to Thursday, 3 o'clock, and guess what? The world didn't end. So suddenly this cult are faced with a huge dilemma. You know, everything we said isn't true. What are we going to do? So what they did, and this is where our minds reframe, basically. So what they did is they said, it didn't end because we were so devout and we prayed so hard, and because we were so consistent, that it didn't end because of us. And therefore we must continue this process of devotion. So they reframed the whole event in order to satisfy their own mind's need to be in a positive framework. And I think in a lesser extent than that, that's what we all do all the time, is that we reframe, and rightly so, quite rightly so. When things don't go right, we tend to take what it is and irrationally reframe it. Why not? I mean, it isn't anybody else's sort of existence, it's our existence. Yeah. So we could frame in any way we want.
This also goes along with almost the one that you were just talking about, the continuity.
Absolutely.
You still have that idea, so you still want to remain true to your ethos and who you are, so you reframe it. And then the other thing I think it's interesting is that when we were talking about they're still remaining on the same path,
yes,
their vision, except they're rerouting their ideas to stay on the optimism bias.
Interestingly, what they actually did was they then sort of went out to the world to get social confirmation that what they were doing was right, because they had to sort of bring other people in to justify how they had reframed this whole experience. And I mean, I would love to get into a conversation with them and try and persuade them that they were wrong. I don't think they'd admit to it at all. I'm sure they could.
And that just shows you how strong our biases can be.
Oh, well, I don't want to get into religion, but
that's, there you go.
Anymore. Okay. We know where I'm going with that.
So irrational optimism helps us survive.
Yeah. So I think optimism is not really a rational thing. It's not something you can figure out and calculate. It's something you think, something you do and you aspire to. So I always call myself a fatal optimist, because, you know, whatever happens, I'm always thinking, yeah, it'll be fine, it'll be great. I'll get there, I'll do this, I'll do that. And if it doesn't work, I'll do this, I'll do that. But I think that's a survival mechanism. I think that's exactly what it is. And that's the core of all of this, is that optimism is something that you have to survive. Yeah. And not as an individual, but as a community, and then as a society, and then globally as well. If you don't have optimism and you don't believe you can do it now, even if that means reframing it to say that, well, the world didn't end and the aliens aren't coming, but that's only because we're doing it right. And again, equate that to politicians, and I mean, I can hear Boris Johnson in my ear, so I know where that's going. Right, I think also that optimism was the probable cause of the 2008 financial crisis. It's optimism, but it's also groupthink. I think everybody thought this bubble is going to go on forever and we're going to be fine and we're going to sell toxic debt and we're going to... And of course, it was complete and utter optimism based on no foundations at all. Now, I'm definitely not. I don't know very much about the 2008 crisis, but one thing I do know, I think, is that it was created by undue and unwarranted optimism. But, you know, that's the wrong side of things, of course. That's where it goes horribly wrong. And I bet we could do a whole book on where optimism has gone completely and utterly wrong.
Yeah.
But I want to just pass over to Christina to talk about athletes, because athletes are very, very, very conscious of the need for optimism in their training.
Yeah, and I think this goes along with a couple lines, not only like professional athletes, but recreational athletes, because we've seen with the big vision of the 4-minute mile, the 2-hour marathon, which I think we just broke. If no one would have ever believed that was possible, they wouldn't be training as hard to their goal. And even for recreational athletes, if you didn't think it was possible for you physically to run a marathon, you wouldn't even start. And millions,
and even if they don't succeed,
yeah,
they still sort of have the ability to think, well, I will perhaps get there.
Perhaps get there. Yeah. And that in itself, just that pure drive to think there's a possibility leads to the training that most of us do daily.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the problem is, of course, that we're hardwired for all of this.
Yeah.
We don't really have a choice. It's there. That's the way that we're constructed. I wouldn't say it's genetic, but we're certainly hardwired for it, and we have to be optimistic. We don't have a choice in the matter. So for me, there's this incredibly strong connection between optimism and the progress of communities. And basically, I think all our cultures are built on optimism. That's where they come from. And it's only because people believe they could do things, be it Michelangelo carving the David, be it Marco Polo going out to, he didn't even know where he was going. He was looking for a different route. Oh, no, sorry, that wasn't him. That was Amerigo. Same difference. But again, it's all about optimism and this visualization of a future, of a different future, a better future, or a different future even. It doesn't really matter. But that's what grows culture. That's what grows societies. And it's not a predictable process because it's too complex. It's an emergent system. So, I mean, the billions of minds all over the world are gently creating new communities that is constantly evolving based on the past, based on a view of the future, and in the present. So it's a very, very odd sort of situation to be in, but it's where we are and what we are. We're here sort of on a little planet, roving around the sun, and there's no one else around except us. So we might as well make the best of it. Be optimistic, I think.
Yes, exactly.
So I think I'm just about, I mean, there's some slightly sort of more contrite philosophical arguments within all of this, but I'm not going to go into those tonight. But basically, optimism is all about sort of surviving and thriving. That's how we build the world. You know, we build it on optimism. Now, that may be at the expense of other people sometimes, or at the expense of nature, or at the expense of different things. But it doesn't change the fact that people thought what they were doing was a good thing or a right thing or a better thing. And it has some terrible consequences sometimes, as with the 2008 financial crisis, as with DDT, I mean, I could go on and name sort of millions of things where we think or genetic engineering is also one of those things that we don't know the consequence, but we're going into it thinking, yeah, you know, this could be amazing, could solve the food problems in the world. And so it's a fascinating subject, but bear in mind that you don't have a choice. You have to be optimistic. That's it. You've got no other place to go. So next week.
Yes. So next week we have multiple intelligences. This is going to be one of my favorites. Because I do teach a lot of different sports, I find that how you talk to people and how they pick it up is an extremely interesting subject. And you'll be able to figure out what intelligence you are and possibly how you can learn on a more streamlined base. And
I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to go and do an IQ test or whatever it is, Myers-Briggs, whatever it is. Just to see, because from my viewpoint, that is not what intelligence is. That's the ability to do a certain thing in a certain way. Yeah. But we use it as a benchmark in businesses, in communities, in societies. Not a good benchmark, I think.
It's almost a bias. Because
well,
right?
The bias is on the other side, isn't it?
I know. Yeah, it is. It's on the other side. Okay, multiple intelligences. And that will be next week. So
yeah, more indeed.
Huh?
That's very interesting. So see everybody next week.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.